I always have to cough before I do that. Hey, everybody. I'm live. I don't know exactly what being live line goes on, but okay. So I just changed the roast, getting the mic hooked up again. Here's what happened. I went to put that audio file in from the Booze Whisperette, and it didn't work. So I sent a frantic email. She totally exported it in a different format. We got it in, and it's 4 mocktail recipes. They all sound pretty good. Since I'm keto, some of them are less something I'm able to do. But I've been playing with alcohol-free spirits, and I'll start throwing some of those recipes out too, probably on YouTube, just because it's been a fun little adventure. And I'm gonna try her. I think it was a mojito. Was it a mojito? Anyway, I'm gonna try that soon. Anyway, so we're gonna get back into recording. I've already said, because I just kind of patched out all that and then went into the main topic of today's show. And I've already said that. So now I'm going to jump in. And if you feel like commenting, you're totally welcome to. Okay, so we talked about earlier how a lot of people are afraid to do pressure canning. It's kind of funny, isn't it? And I also was a little bit afraid, not because of the exploding canner sort of thing, but because of what if I do it wrong, right? Those are the two reasons that people are afraid. It's that one, you might have a canner explode if you do it wrong, and two, if you don't do it safely, then your risk is botulism. Botulism sounds like a really nasty way to go. And so, basic best practices on home canned foods, if it's done in a pressure canner, anything done in a pressure canner, boil it on the way back out, right? So if you're heating soup that you've pressure canned, boil it for 5 minutes at least. They say 15. I talked to a lab and they said it has to be boiling for 60 seconds. And that breaks down the toxin left behind by the botulism organism, right? And so I took that personally and decided for me it's 5 minutes, not 15. And when you're heating something up on the stove anyway, you're boiling it. So that totally works out for me. So I'm just saying that at the beginning. So, if you did make a mistake, there is a way to protect for that just in integrating best practices into how you use your high pressure foods. That said, there's no reason to have grown that organism to begin with. And it starts with, choosing your produce very carefully. So here's when you use a pressure canner. A pressure canner is used for things that have a higher pH than about, I think 4.6 is the official cutoff. I do it for anything that goes above 4.4. Tomatoes are right on that 4.4, 4.3, 4.2 line when you are taking their pH, and it depends on the variety of the tomato, how young or old it is, because you want to do ripe ones, not overripe ones, not underripe ones. And what happened with the soil that day. So some people pressure can tomatoes. I don't. I take the pH, and if I don't have my pH strips, then I add a little bit of vinegar or a little bit of lemon juice or a little bit of citric acid to the tomatoes. Well, once we get over that line, and that's for you, your typical vegetable like squash, pumpkin, green beans, corn, any vegetable that's not a fruit is very likely to be a high pH, which means low acid, right? Because a low pH is acidic and a high pH is basic. Those things are likely to be a low acid thing that you're going to want to pressure can. And I find the best way to figure this out is to go to Google, type in how to can green beans, and wait for the National Center for Home Food Preservation's recipe to come up. Ball also has a lot of stuff available online that you can look at. Recipes that are not in their books, by the way. Their online repository is way better than their books. Or I mean, I guess if you buy all the books they've ever made, maybe you get everything that's online. But I've found the internet's been a great resource for me to be able to figure out how to can things safely. And all of those recipes have been laboratory tested, which means they have run the canner with probes in the middle of the jar in different places in the jar to make sure the proper heat is achieved. So here's what you're doing with pressure canning. You're putting things in a pressure canning. It's building up atmospheric pressure, basically. Like we have a certain amount of atmospheric pressure just from gravity hitting us. And when you enclose things in a pressure canner and heat them up and heat up the water, you increase the pressure in that closed environment, which means that the temperature can get hotter than just putting something in boiling water, because water boils at the temperature at which water boils, right? That's the way that works. And so because of that, we can get a higher temperature. I believe we're taking things up to about 212 degrees as opposed to 180 degrees. And that higher temperature kills the botulism organism. Best thing that can ever happen is you never get it in there. Botulism lives in the dirt. So you want to clean your vegetables. You want to get vegetables in and get them processed without having them sit around for too long. And all of those things help you keep any toxins out of your pressure canner. Okay, here's what you need to pressure can. You need your ball jars. You need your lids. You need your canner, a pressure canner, like a proper pressure canner. There are two kinds. You'll have the weighted gauge and the pressure gauge. I actually like the weighted gauge better because it's a weight, which depending on pressure, like the outside atmospheric pressure, that all adjusts for itself. And because you don't have to get them retested every year. However, the gauged ones are the ones that have, like, they're the most affordable. And that's actually what I use. I have borrowed weighted gauge ones, but I have an actual a gauge one. I'm sorry. Anyway, you see what I'm saying? Like one has a dial, one is a weight. I use the one with the dial. The thing that can happen with your pressure gauge when you have the dial is it can over time become less accurate. So what I do is annually I go down to my county extension office before using it. And I walk into the office and I hand it to the lady with a tester, and she has a tester to tell me if my gauge is accurate. My gauge is not accurate. I'm glad I went in and did that, because part of pressure canning is getting it up to a certain amount of pressure and holding it there for a certain amount of time. And had I not known my gauge wasn't working right, I wouldn't know what to do. Now, she tests it. She says, you are low by this amount. So you have two choices. One, get a new gauge. Two, bring it to a higher amount, because the reason mine is off is just like something, where the little arrow is turning is off. So what I do is I have to add an extra pound or two of pressure. So if I'm bringing it to 11 pounds of pressure, I go to 13, right? Because better to have too much pressure and have a higher temperature than not have enough pressure. So those are the two kinds of pressure canners. Of course, there are electric ones too. That opens up a whole can of worms of debates. And it's super easy to pressure can in those. But we're talking to those people who are looking at their pressure canner that they bought 5 years ago and still haven't used. If that is you, or if it was a year ago or 2 years ago, I'm talking to you today because I want you to use that thing. The cool thing about stovetop pressure canners is you can do a lot of stuff at one time, right? You can do, mine can do, I think, 14 pints and 7 quarts. So when I'm doing a bunch of little pints of green beans, I can do double layer in the pressure canner and I can just knock it out, right? My electric pressure canner does 4. So if I'm only using the electric pressure canner, it's only 4. That doesn't work for me, right? Not when I have a bushel of green beans to process. So that's and then you need like all what you would have already had for water bath canning, which is, a jar lifter. You need to have some way to put them on, a way to cool them without ruining your counters. It's lids and rings. Like all of those things are the same. The only difference from water bath canning to pressure canning is you need the pressure canner and you need the pressure canner. Right? That's it. So it's not a big stretch going from one to the next. And in fact, I had a water bath canner first, got a pressure canner, and realized I only need the pressure canner. I only need the pressure canner because I can use it as a water bath canner. So, that's kind of, in hindsight, I could have saved whatever, the $30 I spent on the water bath canner. I do still use that from time to time. And I kept it. It's really good as a giant stock pot, but I'm not usually running 2 water bath processes at the same time. Although now with my outdoor canning kitchen, I could do one outside and I could do one inside. So that may come out if I end up having a lot of tomato sauce to do this year. I may do 2 batches at one time. So that's the equipment you need. And the other thing I want to say before I jump into the process of how to do it is choosing the right resource for your canning, your pressure canning knowledge. I think is really important. You get a lot of random people writing how they do it, and they include a recipe, right? I tend to verify the times on those recipes because you never know if that person is using great grandma Elma's recipe for something, right? And great grandma Elma's recipe may not have been tested, or they may have found in hindsight it needs to process for longer. So if it's a beet recipe that's not pickled beets, because you can can beets and not pickle them. Don't know why you do that because pickled beets are so amazing, but some people do. I mean, I did it one year actually. That time may have increased, and you can just go to the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which is my favorite resource, and I have a link in the show notes to see. Okay, well, this is the times for beets, and great grandma Elma's recipe is 5 minutes less. So I'm going to do great grandma Elma's recipe, but I'm going to add that 5 minutes. So just double check things. I look at the National Center for Home Food Preservation or the Ball site or any of those sort of reputable sites. Anyway, and guys, today we are recording this while also streaming on YouTube, and I got a comment on YouTube that was pretty cool that I'm going to integrate right now. Somebody said, I need to get a good canning book. Yes, you do, Corey. You do need a good canning book. And actually, a lot of people recommend the Ball one, and that's a great one. I use most often the Encyclopedia of Country Living by Carla Emery, which has more than canning. It has like everything you could ever think you might need to do on a homestead, I swear, is in this book, including lots of canning recipes and lots of really good. If you like to read, her introductions to her chapters are really entertaining, and she's pretty good at explaining how the canning process works. So, I mean, I would start with that before I even got the Ball canning book or another book. And then the internet is your playground for resources on canning. And the interesting thing I find about things online for canning, like your extension office is going to be really supportive about you using best practices. Our extension office does like free canning workshops from time to time, or not very expensive ones. Like I would charge more than they charge to do a canning workshop. And it's a government program. And this is where you get a push-pull with the government, right? So we have the commercial centralized food system, which, for them to do like from the food safety on the FDA side of things, commercial food is safer than home canned. So the FDA is not super excited about home canned food. On the other hand, we've got our extension office, which I believe is an arm of the USDA, who is also very involved in inspecting food production in the country. And they're trying to make sure they have systems in place so that people who are home preserving do it safely, which is why they will test your pressure gauge whenever you walk into the office. That's one of the things they do. It's why they do outreach on how to do canning properly. So there's this like tension between those two agencies that as you get further and further into farming, homesteading, and food sorts of things, especially if you start selling something, you'll start seeing this push-pull of like FDA really wishes we never would do anything on our own. And USDA is like, here's how you do that safely. And they get excited, right? Like they get excited when you can things that are a little bit different. Like because this all then links back into our state fairs, right? Or our fairs. The state fair people were like over the top excited that I did pickled watermelon rinds one year. I got honorable mention on that one because they're like, it's really nice when people get so far into canning that they start doing things that aren't, corn, beans, pickles, stuff like that, tomatoes. Those are the 4 things most people just can, right? And those are the 4 things I can the most of. So You'll see that push-pull if you start talking to some of these agencies. Anyway, with that, I'm going to run into the process of pressure canning on a stovetop pressure canner. And the first thing you do is you get all your supplies. So you get your jars, your lids, your rings, your pressure canner, and you sterilize the jars. Some people bake them in the oven to get them hot enough. Some people will use bleach or another sterilization thing. You clean them, bleach them, good to go, right? I boil mine. So I'll boil them I'll just fill up the pressure canner, cover the jars, boil the lids, the rings, and the jars in the pressure canner. Okay, this is where I'm telling you what you should do and not what I do, though. That's what I used to do. And then I did a bunch of research and realized that when you're pressure canning, the temperature gets so hot, anything alive on those jars would be dead. So I cut a corner here sometimes, and sometimes I wash the jars really well, and then I dry them and I use them to can. That's my confession. That is a decision I am not recommending you do from a food safety standpoint, just to be clear. It's just after I did some food safety research, I decided that step that's so very vigorously enforced is less important. Although if you have crap on your jars or your jars have been sitting around a basement a long time or something, I would boil them. Like I would boil them. Just because you want to make sure there's nothing on the jars. Okay. Then you choose your produce carefully. The best situation is you've picked your beans the night before, you get up in the morning, you wash them, and you can them. Even better is if you can pick them and can them right away. But as we discussed earlier this year, if you spend 6 hours picking the beans, and then you start canning, it makes for a really long day. So a little bit better timing is do it the night before and then be able to start in the morning. And then you don't wear yourself out. You want to choose vegetables that are ripe, but not overripe. The bruised ones I put aside. The ones with bug bites, I cut out the bug bites. Like, you want to have good quality produce. You don't want to have it overripe. An underripe green bean isn't really a thing, right? It's not a big deal. It still tastes okay. It's just smaller. And if it's super underripe, it's tiny, tiny. I would just do like a pickled relish with that for fun. But yeah, choose your produce carefully, get it fresh. If you're buying it from a farmer, find out what I do when I'm doing something like okra or something else. I find out when they're going to pick, and then I try to pick it up from them if I'm going to buy from the farmer right away. Because sometimes it's been picked for 7 or 8 days before you get it. You want to know that stuff at the store has been picked for 7 or 8 days, up to 2 weeks by the time you get it. You can still can it, though. I mean, it's usually in pretty good shape. You just need to make your best decision. If it looks like it's about to turn, don't put that in a jar, right? Just don't put it in a jar. So choose your produce carefully. And then there are 2 packing methods. There's the hot pack method and the raw pack method. Personally, I usually do the raw pack method because it is faster and easier for me. But the hot pack method is totally legitimate and valid. For the hot pack method, you prepare your beans, which means you cut off the tips and the stems. If they're string beans, you're going to, snap off the strings so you don't have strings in the jars, which is really not very tasty. And then you bring water to a boil that you're going to pack them in. You cover them with that water, bring it to a boil them for 5 minutes, and then you pack the beans in the jars and you pour that boiling water over it so that they're completely covered by the water. And then you put the lids and the rings on and you process them. Okay. Hopefully that wasn't too fast. That's the hot pack method. Raw pack method, same thing. You prepare your beans, you put them in the jars, you boil water, and then you pour boiling water over the top of those. In the first method, the beans have been boiling for 5 minutes before they get processed. In the second method, they haven't. Okay. And sometimes you may have a vegetable that needs to be softened up a little bit more than the canning process does, although that has never happened to me ever in my entire life. But sometimes you do. That would be a reason that you want a hot pack versus raw pack. Okay. But to me, I've never understood why we need to hot pack most things. It's just an option. There's the 2 ways to do it. So personally, I raw pack, which means I take the strings off, I pack the beans in, and then I cover them with water, and then I put the lids on and the rings on. Okay. Now we're going to talk about headspace. Headspace is the space from the top of the water, beans are under that water, to the top of the jar. For a bean, for pressure canning, pretty much anything you leave an inch of headspace. Some things may have more. I've never come across anything. You leave an inch of headspace. If you leave 3/4 of an inch of headspace, what will happen is as things heat up in the jar, they expand. They take up more space in the jar, and eventually they take up so much space in the jar that liquid shoots out. So it boils up and over in the pressure canner, and then you'll know you screwed up when you come out and half your jar has liquid, and then there's beans on top of it and air in there. That's a very common canning error. Over time, you'll get really good at gauging if it's half an inch or an inch on the edge of your jar, but they have a tool you can measure with, or you can use a measuring tape. But you want to make sure you have at least an inch. If it's an inch and an eighth, that is better than 3/4 of an inch of headspace in this case. So for green beans, the size of the bean is something. This is new. So every time I've canned green beans, every recipe I've said says break them up into 1-inch pieces, pack them loosely in the jar, not tightly, because if you pack them tightly in the jar, it changes where the water is around them in the canning, and then the center may not get high enough temperature because it's too densely packed. So 1-inch pieces, loosely packed, covered with water, 1-inch headspace, and then max headroom. And then you put the lid and the ring on, and you can add up to a half teaspoon for pints or a teaspoon for quarts of salt just to improve the flavor. I never add the salt anymore because I can add that on the way out, and then I don't end up with oversalted stuff. That's just me. You can do what you want. So today I was doing research at my favorite place, just because the other rule I have about canning is when you haven't canned something for a year, you go back and you look at the charts and the times and you reread how to do it so you don't screw it up and then put all that effort in, right? National Center for Home Food Preservation says the following: you can break them up into pieces, or you can pack them whole, or you can pack them in bigger pieces as long as they're loosely packed. Who even knew, right? So apparently you can pack whole beans. Every other resource I ever saw said 1-inch pieces, and I assumed that was because they had tested that and that gave enough space around the bean for it to get high enough. So that's an update for me. I learned something new today. I love it when I learn new things about canning. So you get those packed, hot or raw, and then you process them for 20 minutes for pints, 25 minutes for quarts at 11 psi if you are under 1,000 feet altitude. So what happens is the atmospheric pressure, if you're higher than that, changes, and then you have to change your processing time in your canner or bring it up to a higher pressure. I think it's 15 pounds of pressure that they bring it up to. So like if you're in Colorado, you're well over that. And there's a sliding scale by your altitude. So you need to know what your altitude is. Luckily, Google Earth has your house on a map and you can go look at what your altitude is. That's how I figured out what mine is. I am at like 800, and which means I'm close to 1,000, but not super close. And then up at the ridge is over 1,000. So if I decided to move my house up that ridge behind me to the very tippy top, my canning times would change. So, and that's just for pressure canning. Actually, no, it changes for water bath too, come to think of it. Yeah. Altitude's a thing, guys. Go look it up. Go look it up. Okay. So that's the basic overview of how to pressure can. But now let's talk about how that works with a stovetop pressure canner. So I have a Presto pressure canner, and I've also used my friend's All American. The All American's way better. It's also way more expensive, and what fit in my budget was the Presto. I have had the Presto for 14 years. I have replaced the gasket, and I have replaced the gauge one time. Okay? So it's been pretty good to me, and I spent like $65 plus, I've probably spent $100 on the whole thing in the lifetime of the canner. An All-American canner right now is $450 flippin' dollars because people are panicked because of COVID and they're buying canning stuff. So if I were you, I would keep my eye out for a used one if you're going to go All-American, or just wait a year or two. And I mean, even the Presto canners are more expensive. It's weird. Anyway, so what you do is you're going to have your jars. Your jars are hot, right? When they have the hot, you've either poured hot water over cold beans or you have boiled the beans and put them in the jar. So you've got that going. You've got them ready to go. In your canner, it will have instructions on how many quarts of water to put in there. I believe mine takes 4 quarts, but there's also a really handy line on the side, on the inside. It's about this far up the pressure canner. It says bring water to this height for pressure canning. It doesn't say that in there, but it says it in the manual and you can see the tick mark. So I can just pour water in and I take hot water from the tap so that it doesn't have to heat as much. I bring it up to that line. I add a dash of vinegar. The reason I add the vinegar is that if I don't add the vinegar, I end up with white scum on the outsides of my jars and they look ugly. If I put vinegar in there, that like hard water deposit thing does not happen. If you accidentally forget the vinegar, which I totally do at least once a year, you can take a paper towel and some vinegar and clean it off. It's possible to clean it off. It just takes a little bit more effort. So you get hot water in there, you bring it to a boil, you put your jars in, and then you clamp the lid down firmly. And it's just the lid. There's no weight on top or anything. You just clamp it on, bring it back to a boil because that'll keep it from being at a boil. And for the Presto, you wait till you've had about 10 minutes of a consistent steam coming out of there. I think they do that step to make sure you're really at a boil and really ready and that you've gotten your level of your stove dialed in right for pressure canning. Okay. I use a gas stove. So that 10-minute time is not as, like I can dial it in within 5 minutes. If I was on an electric coil stove though, I'd totally take the full 10 minutes making sure because electric coil stoves go up and down in pressure a lot less quickly. Okay, so once you have it with the consistent steam coming out for 10 minutes, you drop a weight on there. And this is where I don't want you to get confused. I have a dial gauge pressure canner, but the weight you drop on there covers where the steam's getting out, okay? And that's what starts making the pressure stay inside the pressure canner. That is not a weighted gauge. It's just a weight that you use on your pressure canner. A weighted gauge, when it doesn't have the dial, right? And you drop the weight on and it's based on the weight, it dials in how things happen. And I've only seen one canner like this. It was an All-American. It was really cool. And in fact, I don't know if they make them anymore, but they might. I haven't looked it up in a while. So anyway, you drop that on there and what'll happen is pressure starts building up because the water is boiling and there's steam in the pressure canner. Pressure starts building up. And then there's this other piece that is a lid lock. And eventually pressure gets so high, it pushes up and it goes thoop. And that makes it so you couldn't take the lid off if you wanted to. And that's a good thing because if you take the lid off when it's still under pressure in there, things could explode out and burn you, and that would be bad. So you don't want that. Okay, so that thing goes up, and then you'll see your dial will come up to the correct pressure, 11 pounds. And I've said something incorrect. The All-American weighted pressure canner does have a dial because it comes up to 11 pounds, which is when I know when to put the timer on. So erase what I said earlier. It had a gauge now that I'm thinking about it. Anyway, so it comes up to 11 pounds of pressure. Okay. And then you start your timer. And for green beans, that's 20 minutes for pints and 25 minutes for quarts. I tend to put green beans in quarts because it's only 5 more minutes. Corn, to go from quart to pint to quart, is a much larger increase of time. So before making that decision, look at the times. If it's only 5 more minutes, you might as well just use bigger jars and get it done with, in my opinion. If it's almost twice the time to do the bigger amount, I do the less amount because if it's almost twice the time to process corn, or if it's 20 more minutes or a lot more time, I can't remember what the time is off the top of my head. You're really cooking that corn for a really, really, really long time. So I like to do it the other way. So you hold it there. And this is where, when you're doing the stovetop thing, you can't just walk away. You kind of got to keep your eye on that pressure because you don't want it dropping below the 11 PSI, right? And I don't know if it's PSI, but anyway, it must be PSI. And because if it does, you have to restart your time. So if it stays at 11 the whole time for 20 minutes, you're good, or 25 minutes. Does that mean I'm staring at the gauge the whole time? No, that's usually when I sit down and do something in my journal, or I'm cleaning up the kitchen behind the big mess I made when I put all of the stuff in the jars. Okay. But I keep my eye on the gauge every few minutes. And if it looks like it's going to drop down, then I increase the heat. The opposite usually happens with me, though, when I'm pressure canning. It's that it starts going up. And if you go up too high, that's also an issue, right? So I keep mine at 12 to 13 anyway when I'm supposed to be at 11, so that if it drops a little bit, I don't get into trouble. And if it starts climbing above 13, then I turn the heat down. And almost every time I pressure can something on the stove, it stays pretty solid at 12. And then it starts creeping up to 13, and I have to start dialing it down as it gets through the cycle. I don't know if that's just because there's less liquid in there to boil over time, but that's what always happens to me. So then once it gets to the time of 25 minutes for quarts, I turn the heat off and I walk away. So what's happening now is that things cool down in the pressure canner on their own. You don't take things off and let steam out like with an instant pot or something. You just let it chill. And the weight on top of the steam thing's probably been shaking because some steam's still getting out, and you're maintaining pressure, so that's fine. So some steam will still come out a little bit, and then eventually that little lock thing that popped up will go thump, back down. Once that happens, you wait another 10 minutes to be really sure that there's no pressure in there anyway. Your gauge is at 0. That thing has gone down. And then you take the lid off and you carefully move the very, very hot jars, big burning risk, guys, big burning risk, to a place where they can cool for 12 to 24 hours. Once you get them settled, don't mess with them. Just let them sit there. What's going to happen, sometimes there'll be some action, like when I do broth, like sometimes it's still letting it'll let air out. That's okay. Air is coming out, air is not coming in. That's how jars work, right? And you just let it cool until it's all the way cool, and it'll basically seal that lid, and they're sealed when it sucks down there's a dimple on a lid, so it sucks down that lid. I just go through, and in about 12 hours I go and I can tell by the sound if it has sealed or not. Okay? So that is basically the process of pressure canning. Now, here's what happens with my Presto canner if I let the pressure go too high. First of all, the gauge has a big red section. It can get into the big red section and still nothing's going to happen. That's why they have the red section. It's there to get my attention. But the Presto lid has an extra little black plug that if for some reason I was to just forget I was canning, right, and walk away, that thing will shoot out and let pressure off before the canner will explode. It's a safety feature that's built in. Once that thing shoots out, though, you have to buy a new plug and replace it. I have never done this. Sometime I might just set up something outside and do it. The thing I do when I'm canning, though, because that plug's on one side, I put it on the back. So if for some reason the worst were to happen and that plug were to shoot out, it would shoot back into my wall and not forward into my face. That's it. That's my one thing about safety on that. Besides the fact those jars are really hot when they come out. So kids and animals out of the kitchen is always a good idea at that point, unless you're teaching the kids safely how to can. So that's how you can green beans. I love having them around for the winter. On the way out, I'll put them, if I'm going to make a stew or something, I'll pour liquid everything into a pot, bring it to a boil for 5 minutes, and then pour it into the crock pot or make the rest of my stew in that. And I use the water around it too. So, because why wouldn't you? That's a way to get all of the nutrition that's in the jar is to also consume the water. With that, I do want to remind you that we have a chicken processing workshop September 21st, and you can sign up for that over at livingfreeintennessee.com. I have sold all the tickets, but I'm going to sell 2 more tickets to this workshop because probably somebody who's already bought a ticket will cancel, and then they'll be really happy that there's a replacement person for them, right? So a couple more tickets have been opened up today. Once they're sold, they're sold. Also, The Saturday before that, because that's a Monday, there is Green Chili Day at the Holler, and the link to sign up for that is in the show notes today. I'm not putting it out publicly yet. I'm just letting people who listen to the podcast or watch the YouTube get signed up. And that's over at livingfreeintennessee.com in the show notes. It costs $10 for members, $20 for non-members. And we'd love to see you there. We're going to have a great day learning how to make tamales and doing farm tours. And there'll be a keg or two around, and we'll have some music. If you decide that you want to have alcohol at that event, you are invited to sleep over. Actually, if you don't have alcohol, you're still invited to sleep over, camp outside. We have, composting out houses and a hand washing sink and a whole bunch of other stuff, an outdoor shower the next morning if you need it. And that's all included. So hope to see you there. With that, guys, go out, make it a great week. It would have been really sad for me if I would have just looked up at my editing software and seen that, oops, I forgot to hit record. That happened to me once. That has happened to me. Actually, twice when I've interviewed people. I've been like, that's a great start to your interview. Let's start it over because I didn't hit record. And then they're like, Anyway, hey, guys online, thanks for listening today. And I will see you. Let's see what's going on. So YouTubers, 7 p.m. Thursday, we have the Holler Neighbor live stream. So if you want to join us for that, we're going to talk a little bit about homeschooling and some other stuff because, as we navigate having a new neighbor who also has kids, we're starting to think about like, how does that look if she decides to homeschool? Because she works all day. Yeah. So we'll see how that goes. Anyway, I hope you join us there and hope you have a great afternoon.